Hi.
Thank you so much for streaming your classes. Literally, you're the only professor I had. Because I had COVID, and it was so shitty. Like, I was like, just in the morning being like, like at least somebody, like it's like, don't come to school if you're sick, but we're not going to give you any resources. And it's like, most of my classes are in physiology. I'm like, this is so disappointing. It's like, you guys are a part of medicine.
It's an attitude that I just genuinely don't understand. Because it's honestly really easy to do. Like, I mean, it's just like, this thing cost me like $60, and I've used it for like 2 years, and it allows me to capture the sound. That's really the only problem. But yeah, it's like, don't come to school, but you'll miss important stuff that you'll never recover.
No, actually, yeah. So I ended up just like once I like wasn't in the infection stage anymore, I ended up just going and like masking and sitting by myself, and like I was so tired. I'm like, this is so shitty. Yeah, and my professor's like, well, it is what it is.
Yeah, this is but even like COVID or not COVID, like if you have the flu, right? You get a room full of people sick. You get me sick, and then I'm, dragging my ass trying to continue through the term too. So I feel like it makes sense. And again, I feel like the barrier to doing it is quite low. Like I use OBS, it's free.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost anything, right? Like
I don't even know. Honestly, I feel like STEM people, like as a STEM student, professors, I feel like they can just be really like pretentious and be like, oh, Ruth, you need me here. You know what I mean? Like to ask questions. It's kind of like.
Well, is it the best thing? No. Is it better than nothing?
Yeah.
Sure. And should adults be allowed to make their own decisions about whether they want to be like, the class obviously isn't full anymore, but I'm like, people are adults, they can make their own decisions.
There's like a lot of people sick.
And they're overworked, right? They have assignments too, and they're balancing. People do this complex balancing act. A lot of people work, right? So if you can't make your rent, you need to pick up an extra shift, right? Like, whatever, I don't care. Like, let's just do the exams, I don't think you'll do as well as if you're in class, but that's like an adult decision, of me imposing my own shit on you, right?
Well, that's really nice.
Well, I honestly, it's so little work that I don't see it's hard for me to make an argument against doing it because it's so unbelievably easy to do. So I'm just like, well, if I can do it, I had this argument a few years ago, and they slightly disappointed me a little because I was like, it's so easy to do. Why wouldn't I do it? It takes virtually no effort. And they're like, well, you make other people look bad. I'm like, well, that's on them, not on me. But, so I try to keep it quiet, but obviously I so I won't post them on E-class directly, but they're on YouTube, and anyone who wanted to could easily find it. Yeah, no worries, it's super easy. Oh, while you're coming in, can you just move that chair in so I don't have to walk all the way around? Awesome, thank you. There we go. How are we doing for time? Oh, I got minutes. Oh. Oops. I don't want to lose that. Those are valuable. Oh. Mm.
Alrighty, let us get started here. Okay, so last week we finished up finally. It took us 2.5 weeks really, because the first week barely counts. But we finished up talking about how religion works, right? According to Smith, and these kind of 10 ways that religion influences society over time, right? So today we're going to start into something that's maybe a little bit more traditional in terms of sociology classes, right? Which is looking at some of the core theories of religion, that have been historically important in the field. Now, unlike a lot of sociology classes, these theories actually are important for the rest of the class. So definitely, as we're going through the theories, make sure that you, especially the big ones, right? And you'll notice the big ones by the fact that I give them a lot of time. So things like sacred canopy, market theory, in particular, are two big ones. Anyway, we'll talk about it, don't worry. But just remember them, right? Because as we go into the second midterm and the final, you will have to make reference back to these theories to answer a lot of the questions, right? So you won't have to summarize them again, but you're going to need these theories going forward, which is why I say it's a little different from a lot of other sociology classes where like, here's Marxism, now let us never speak of it again. It's true. I've taught those classes. It's like, here are some theories. Why am I teaching them? I don't know. This is why in sociology of youth, I had a whole section on concept, which I cut out of the course entirely because I'm like, I never talk about these again. Why am I teaching them if they're that unimportant? Anyway, youth is not this class. This class, they're super important, right? So you're definitely going to want to know these theories. And some of them I think you'll find very familiar, right? Because there is some Durkheim, Durkee, M-U-G, I don't know, M-U-D. Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, although I'm not incredibly warm to any of these theorists when it comes to religion because, while they're foundational to sociology, I don't know that they tell us a lot about religion in sort of a contemporary setting. Nevertheless, we'll do our best to kind of cover them. Before I jump in though, this is going to take us probably most of the week. Are there any questions? Is there anything that you want to ask about before I get in? Anything from last time that was unclear that you want me to go over again? I have to say, you're the best class for not abusing my Slido. My SOS 100 students have started asking irrelevant questions to the point where I almost have to shut down the questions altogether because it's like, what's your favorite hockey team? I'm like, just stop it. Like, no one cares. You're wasting time. And I know they're doing it on purpose, so I try to be brief about it. But no questions? We're good? All right. Nothing happened. Okay, there we go. All right. So, different theories of religion. So let's start with a friend I lovingly refer to as Uncle Carl, because I feel like I've spent, being a sociologist, I've spent as much time with Karl Marx as I've spent with many of my actual uncles. So Uncle Carl. Okay, so we all know Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx is sort of the founder, in a sense, of a theory of religion that's referred to either lovingly or derisively as deprivation theory, right? So what does Marx basically say, right? So I think you all know he's got this particular view of history, right? That he outlines in the Communist Manifesto, that the hitherto history of mankind is a history of class struggle, right? And it's the slave versus the free in Roman society, the lord versus the serf in medieval society, and then the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie in capitalist societies, right? So everything is about sodal. I'm having a good day. I don't know why. Maybe I played hockey last night and everything hurts this morning, so maybe that's why I can't talk. All right, the social stratification, right? That you have kind of upper classes and lower classes, always, right? The oppressors and the oppressed. And for Marx, religion really is all about dealing with the deprivation that the lower classes experience, right? Why would people be religious? Why would religion be important? Well, of course, for Marx, right, he thinks that it's important in maintaining the class system, right? That at the end, well, like basically, it is a functional tool of the powerful, right? They basically use religion both to justify their position in society, which you could see in something like the medieval idea of the divine right of kings, right? Where the medievals had this sort of idea that, you know, you were put in your social station by God. So if you were a serf, you were born a serf. That's what God wanted you to do. So be happy in your serfdom. And obviously the king is the king because God put the king there, right? So religion can be used as a way to justify the power structure as it exists. So, right, religion propagates ruling class values. And basically, you know, religion was one of the ways of sort of divinizing or giving the imprint of the transcendent to the values of the ruling class. But what does it do for, like, why would the poor, the working class, the serfs, the slaves accept this? Well, specifically because, and here Marx is looking very much through a Christian lens at a Christian society in Europe, right? And so he doesn't maybe see all the ways that other religions don't promise the same things. And frankly, I don't think Marx was particularly interested in that anyway. Being a bit of a cultural chauvinist at the best of times. But basically, you know, Marx has this kind of idea that Christianity and any kind of religion that promises an afterlife makes the living conditions of the, you know, destitute, the poor, seem livable, right? Because even though you're not going to get, you know, in life, you may not be well fed or powerful or any of those things, right? Something like Christianity offers a particular vision of, you know, a kingdom of God where the lowly are made, you know, lords in a sense, right? Where they are brought on high, the powerful are cast down. You know, there's an eternal banquet in heaven, so your belly will always be full in a sort of way. And, you know, you might not get your reward in this life, but you're going to get your reward in the hereafter, right? And that's a pretty, I mean, this is the Marxist kind of reading of Christian doctrine, right? So this is why Marx has this phrase, right? That religion is the opium, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It's the opium of the people, right? So it drugs you, right? You're like poor and you probably should just pick up your pitchfork and go stab the nearest bourgeois, killing him and then seize his property and create communism. But religion keeps you in a sort of socially drugged out state where it's like, well, God put me here to work in this factory 11 hours a day and, just accept it. Like, but I will get my reward after I die. I'll have eternal bliss or whatever. Right. So, and this is a view in a sense with some virtue, right? Certainly religion has often been aligned with the powerful, right? It's been aligned with kings and princes, and religious figures themselves have oftentimes lived as in a sort of royal way. If you look at, say, the Catholic Church, for a while, the cardinals, this kind of second tier down in a sense from the Pope, were referred to as the princes of the church, and they lived like it. And the idea that they were the servants of God was given sort of short shrift, right? So, I mean, Marx is reacting to real things in the world. Religion often being used by the powerful to justify their position. And, in a sense, seeing that, yes, it could be this idea of eternal kind of reward in heaven could keep people in their station. Now, kind of like when I was talking about those social constructionist views of society, it is unfortunately a somewhat caricatured view of religion. And I mean, it comes out of this same, do I have the quote on the next? Oh, that's not the right keyboard. Okay. Oh, I don't have his long quote on it. I think I have that in SOS 100, which, why do you get less than SOS 100? But basically, or maybe I had it earlier in the course. But basically, Marx has this idea, right, that it's kind of from Ludwig Feuerbach, that religion is a sort of wish fulfillment, right? It's doesn't really exist, right? It's socially constructed. It is from this course. It was earlier in the course, right? Religion doesn't make man. Man makes religion, right? Basically to justify the social order and to give themselves some kind of hope and that there's a God out there that's like a good father, even if your earthly father wasn't a particularly good father in some senses. Now, one of the things that I think I mentioned when we talk about social constructionists is that, unfortunately, it's a caricatured view of what religion does in society. And especially, not especially, but particularly because we're talking about the West, when we're talking about Marx, he sort of ignores all those moments where those same religious principles that are sometimes used by kings and princes and popes and cardinals to justify their position get turned on their heads and end up causing just as many problems for those particular powerful people, as they maybe help to justify, right? And you can think of, people like Catherine of Siena, this poor, illiterate woman who goes and basically challenges the Pope, and because of her sort of popular appeal and her use of Christian principles, actually forces real changes in the structure of the church. Martin Luther, who uses religious principles basically to tear apart the whole kind of dominance of the Catholic Church in the West and bring about an entirely new system. Francis of Assisi, who again puts sort of the church establishment to shame and creates a whole new way of understanding Christianity. Yeah, please.
So Marx essentially just ignores every aspect of the spiritual and just looks for it as a tool of suppressing class consciousness.
Yeah, because for Marx, everything is about economics, right? This is one thing you have to remember about Karl Marx, is his view of history is entirely an economic view, right? He's a complete materialist. He doesn't believe that there's anything spiritual, anything theological, transcendent. Everything is just material and material causes, right? So there's nothing outside of that for Marx, and everything, like his whole view of history is economic. It's all about the way we make things, right? And then this dialectic, right? Changes in the means of production leads to changes in the social conditions of production, which leads to a transformation of society. But that's his entire view of history. There's nothing else. He doesn't even see how religion could affect history in major ways. Yeah.
So the upper class created religion.
Well, that's Marx's contention, right? That it basically is functionally sort of created by the upper class in order to control society, right? So they create it in such a way as it justifies their own authority. Yeah, please.
So I know last class you were saying Christianity was kind of unique because it favored the weak or the victims.
Well, that's what Tom Holland says, right? So yeah.
So if that theory was presented to Marx, would he be like, yeah, because it's aimed at them because it's aimed to tell them, oh, there's something better. You don't have to do anything in this life. You have the next life to worry about.
Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable. I don't have a Ouija board. I suppose we could break it out and try to call up the spirit of Karl Marx. If he doesn't believe he had a spirit, so maybe we can. I don't know. But yeah, I think that'd be a reasonable kind of Marxist interpretation. It's like, oh yeah, it just promises, something better in the afterlife. So yeah, you don't have to do anything in this life to make things better, right? You don't have to overthrow or worry about oppression and injustice. But I think that's a reasonable Marxist reading. But maybe you could see like that where the blinders are on Marxists a little bit there as well, where they can't see. Well, and like certainly Weber will see, and Weber comes later in this kind of conflict theory vein, and Weber can definitely see where I have Weber. I have him on another slide. Weber can definitely see where religion can be transformative, and transform society. Rejigger kind of social bounds in major ways, which he writes a whole book called The Protestant Ethic and Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism about. But really Marx, right, because it's a tool of the oppressors, it can never really be something that transforms society because it's always going to be in the kind of service of the ruling class, right? Again, I think there's blinders on there. I think there's much more of maybe even a dialectic than Marxists have tended to see in religion, right? Where it can challenge the powerful, and then the powerful will themselves sort of assimilate those beliefs, take religion over again, and then the two steps sort of begins. But I don't think Marxists tend to see that, again, because their thinking tends to be pretty, binary in some ways. Can you tell I'm not like a Marxist at all, and I don't really care for it? So Marx was certainly someone who believed in a sort of secularization theory, which the next unit in the course is secularization. But he believed religion was going to fade away because it was part of what made economic oppression possible. And he thought capitalism was doomed, right? He thought that capitalism held within it the seed beds of its own destruction because it treated the working class so poorly that eventually they would have to rise up, pitchfork the bourgeoisie, take the means of production, and then basically you would have a society where everybody's material needs were met, right? And once everybody's material needs were met in, an advanced socialist society that's also materialistic, or materialist in its epistemology, there'd be no reason to have religion, right? It would have no purpose in a world where there's no scarcity, right? So this is why we call it deprivation theory, right? Because for Marx, fundamentally, religion emerges from the deprivation of material wealth and sufficiency of, whatever the underclass is. They're deprived, so they need religion to make it bearable. Once everybody has, everything they need, you no longer need religion. Please.
Wouldn't that only really work for like societal issues, like healthcare and education, like that being free, that would increase quality of life. But let's say someone in your family gets cancer, that would probably make you turn to religion, or because that's an impersonal thing that no one can really control.
Yeah, things like terror management are not amongst Marx's strongest concepts, right? He sees religion really just in economic terms because Marx sees everything in economic terms, right? But yeah, I mean, what you're describing is maybe a little bit like terror management, or I don't know that's more of a psychology way of looking at religion than a sociology one. I see your psychology t-shirt, or sweatshirt, so I could tell where you're coming from. Please don't take Intro to Methods with me. I say nothing but bad things about psychology all the time. Literally, I spent my whole weekend marking people's research questions and being like, this is really more of a psychology question more than a sociology one. Anyway, write better questions. No, I'm kidding. Terror management, this idea that people need to believe in something, especially when kind of faced with, life's challenges. That's not something that I think really fits into that Marxist framework very well, because it is so, the only reason you believe in God is because your life sucks now, right? And once your life doesn't suck, well, you kind of won't need that anymore. And it's a fairly durable belief. Most kind of classical theories of secularization and their sort of more recent revivals still have this sort of dynamic built into them that once people have material sufficiency, religion no longer serves any purpose. Okay, how are we doing with Marx? That's not Marx. That's Groucho Marx, not Karl. He's a famous comedian from the beginning of the 20th century. Oops, I've broken it. There we go. Okay, my buddy, Emil Durkheim. He puts the fun in functionalism. All right, so yeah, Emil Durkheim, right, very much known as a functionalist and the sort of founder of functionalism as a sociological school. And his contribution to the study of religion comes from this book, 1912's Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Now, there's a lot to, I think, recommend Durkheim's view. I think he thinks more deeply about religion than Marx does. Marx doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about religion because he's so dismissive of it. Durkheim, wrote a whole book on it. There are some problems with Durkheim's account. The principal one being that he never really, he didn't do any on-the-ground research with regard to religion. He took, say, a bunch of ethnographic data put together by anthropologists about the Arunta people of Australia, right, an indigenous group in Australia, and basically looked at what that had to say about the religion of the Arunta, and made a bunch of broad claims from that, right? So what does he say, right? So, I mean, this is this is what we call armchair sociology, right? He does it from his armchair in France. There's no real on the ground kind of research. And there's much to be commended about armchair sociology. It's much more comfortable. The travel's much less daunting, between here and my sofa is not as big a distance as between here and Australia. But what Durkheim says, right, religion is basically all about binding communities together in this functionalist view, right? And you got to remember, so from the functionalist view, every social structure has a purpose, right? It exists and it was created by societies because it serves some kind of beneficial purpose for those societies, right? It doesn't exist arbitrarily. Now again, Durkheim is a materialist. Durkheim doesn't think there is anything behind religion at the end of the day, but that it exists for entirely social reasons, right? So, it plays a part in the production of social order. Specifically, right, religion provides socially agreed upon values and norms and gives them a kind of air of the supernatural or the transcendent or the otherworldly to kind of make them almost unchallengeable, right? So it takes the values and norms that keep a society functioning, makes them shared, right, because everybody participates in the religion, and then gives them, the kind of veneer of the transcendent on top of them so that they seem unchallengeable at the end of the day. It ritualizes experience, right? And specifically, right, into a collective effervescence, right? Something that everybody shares in and everybody kind of feels the emotions bubbling up within them from those particular religious ceremonies, right? When people gather together for religious rituals, the mood is heightened, effervescence, right? Bubbles like soda, right? Or beer, right? Is generated, except it's bubbles of feelings and emotion within people, by meeting with people who are like-minded, right? And this can be, a whole number of things. Like Durkheim isn't particularly picky, and he's a little bit more broad-minded in looking outside of say, Christianity for some of his examples, right? So you could see this in, say, even if you've ever been to an indigenous drumming ceremony, right? You can kind of, I think, at least when I've been, you feel this kind of collective effervescence, right? Everybody gets really into it. There's singing, there's drumming, there's the rhythm, and there's a sort of heightened emotion that can come in these sort of ceremonies, right? The same thing as if you've been to a Pentecostal worship service, right? And everybody's swaying to the soft rock sound of contemporary Christian music, right? You've got, a kind of emotional buildup in lots of ways. Okay, so those participating, right, and this is Pickering talking about Durkheim's work, feel a bond of community and unity, and they feel morally strengthened, right? So participation in religious rituals heightens group solidarity, especially if you can cast your group as, one and there's another, right? So you can have, if you're Catholic and there's Protestants, you can be like, we all went to Mass today. Not like those filthy Protestants, right? And, if you're Protestants, we all worship the Lord today, not like those dirty Catholics that worship the Pope, right? Or whatever, right? I'm obviously trying to be funny. referencing, centuries old religious conflicts in a funny way is maybe not the best strategy, but we're going to go with it, right? Okay, and very importantly, right, none of this is produced by a supernatural power for Durkheim. It's all a psychological state, right? So it's all just psychology. It's all just part of the human conditions. All of it is a product of society, right? It's not supernatural in any way, shape, or form. Okay, right. So, sorry, I have my Yoda here. In a sense, what Durkheim is saying is that society sort of ends up worshiping itself, right? It worships the rules and the God that it God or gods or religious system that it created that were meant to maintain a kind of social order. So it is a kind of worship of society itself. Okay, like Marx and like Weber and like a whole bunch of others, Durkheim thought religion was in retreat and traditional forms of religious expression were in decline, right? And he's one of a long kind of series of thinkers, many who came before and many who come after, that said religion is basically doomed, right? It's going to be replaced. And now he thinks what it's going to be replaced by, and I think, there's much to recommend this view, actually, especially given the kind of postmodern moment that we're in, that religion would be replaced by a sort of cult of the individual, right? Where everything, the whole society and the whole kind of apparatus of what people find important, what they worship, in other words, would be moved towards, things like individual liberties, individual expression, individual rights, individual identities, right? So again, there's something to recommend this view in general. Medieval societies, right, and pre-medieval societies, he thought were oriented towards the collective survival of the village, right? The common good was the kind of key principle. Religion helped orient people towards what was good for everyone rather than what was good for the individual, right? Your individual identity was less important than the survival of the collective. But what happens with the rise of capitalism, and particularly things like urbanization, the move away from the medieval village, is that you get a transformed society, and one in which the common good and the collective good no longer really make sense, right? Because you're suddenly quite disconnected from the village, right? From the people around you. You're living now in an apartment, in a city. You don't know your neighbors. Your neighbors might not be from the same, place as you. They might not be the same religion as you. And so little might be shared with your neighbors on the whole. This, for Durkheim, was the beginning of a shift towards a sort of liberal individualism. I'm just going to try to move the screen as much as I can with my arm. Liberal individualism, right? Where people more or less operate as individuals rather than as part of a collective, as part of a whole. And people stop seeing each other as members of this bigger collective, and where notions of something like the common good become really, really difficult to articulate. Respect for the dignity and rights of the individual, he thought would be a necessary replacement for religious beliefs. And I think this kind of aspect of Durkheim really makes sense, especially if you look at the way that, say, humanism and notions of human rights were generated in a non-religious way, particularly after the Second World War, right? That, you get the United Nations and its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a sort of way of coming up with the rights of individuals without a sort of religious context. One that would be seen as properly universal, right? Because it would apply to Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, non-religious people, Aborigines, everyone, right? I probably don't have to explain what universal means. Okay. Now, for Durkheim, this does pose kind of a problem, right? And this is where I like the fun of functionalism. Too much individualism, right? Durkheim predicted that if individualism is left unchecked, ultimately what it leads to is the disintegration of a smooth functioning society, because all you have is individuals out for their own good and no sense of shared values, common values, the common good at all. So religion, which had done that, as religion fades, it can no longer instill kind of common values in the group, and therefore everybody sort of starts carrying around their own unique values, but it becomes very hard for people to cooperate. Okay. So we talked about some flaws with the functional definition of religion, earlier in the course, right? The fact that it tends to be too inclusive. Some other flaws of Durkheim, right? So religion, what is it? Religion is an interdependent system of beliefs and practices, this is his definition, regarding things which are sacred, that is to say, set apart, forbidden beliefs and practices which unite all those who follow them in a single common moral community called a church. Obviously, that is a little bit problematic. The concept of church is added to the concept of the sacred and to systems of belief in order to differentiate religion from magic, right? So there has to be an organized way that this all works, which doesn't necessarily involve the consensus of faith. So, right, Durkheim has this weird distinction between religion and magic, right? Magic being sort of a non-church form of spirituality or belief in the transcendence, and church being a kind of structured and organized form, right? Okay. Yeah, please.
Just what does he mean when he says like magic? Like what?
This is one of the problems with Durkheim is he never actually defines his terms. So like there's three terms like magic, the sacred, and the profane that Durkheim never really defines, right? He just sort of takes it for granted that people will know what they are, right? So the sacred is, set apart beliefs and practices. That's all you get as a definition. And the profane is anything that's not the sacred. And that's the most, this is a problem with Durkheim, right? He doesn't give us enough. And the same thing with magic. Magic is any kind of thing that doesn't happen in a church, but still kind of fits religion, right? So he's loose with his terms, and this has caused no ends of problems for people who try to work with his definitions, because it's like, okay, religion is everything that has to do with the sacred. What is the sacred? Well, it's set aside, things that are set apart and forbidden. Okay, so set apart, I mean, the founding fathers in the US are kind of set apart. So are they part of a religion? And that's where you get Bella being like, oh yes, that is American civil religion, right? His lack of kind of precise definition of his terms. And again, he's making a first shot at this, I guess. He's one of the first people to try to do it. And so I think that's where Durkheim in particular at times is a little unsatisfying, right? It's like, yeah, those terms are not defined enough. Does that make sense? Okay. He never tries to define what the sacred is, other than to say it's the opposite of the profane, which he doesn't define either. He doesn't include the supernatural or superhuman powers because he thinks that there are primitive religions that lack them. For example, he says Buddhism lacks reference to the supernatural, and there are certainly forms of Buddhism that do. I think it's Theravada Buddhism. But there are lots of forms of Buddhism that actually do have reference to the supernatural in some kind of ways, even though it isn't the European sense of like God, Yahweh, Jehovah, all that jazz. It's a different sense of the supernatural, but it's still definitely there, right? So, he makes a bunch of mistakes, and this is the danger of doing armchair sociology at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah, please.
I don't understand why he doesn't go for the superhuman powers of like Christianity. They have like God, and just kind of the supernatural angels and stuff with their supernatural power. So he's going to more primitive religions that he says lack them. But so which religion is
So
he defining?
it's a bit of a misunderstanding on his part, right? In that he's working from a very limited body of knowledge. And so he mistakenly sort of thinks that there are certain religions, like certain forms of Buddhism that have no reference to, superhuman powers. And he's not using the term, the supernatural. He's still, I think, locked into a kind of European, Eurocentric kind of view that says, like, if you're going to have a supernatural, it should look something like the Greek gods or the god of Christianity, right? And Islam. And so he's like, he looks at Buddhism and he's like, well, there's no God there, right? At least not in the sense of how Europeans think about it, and sort of misses some of the nuance. He's also getting very incomplete information because, he's writing this over a century ago, and we have a much fuller kind of knowledge of the world than he had, right? So does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. Good. All right. Can we for Durkheim? Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, so for Durkheim, religion was created to protect people's values and norms. Isn't this like Marx with how upper class is protecting their values and norms? The difference is that Durkheim thinks that this is a much more organic process than Marx does, right? Marx thinks that everything, like religion, is sort of created and shaped by the ruling class, whereas for Durkheim, these things sort of emerge almost organically, right? And that's in a way how he justifies the diversity of religious expressions in the world, right? That different kind of social contexts will generate different needs, different kinds of shared values around different communities. So they all kind of bubble up different sort of religions kind of naturally, right? So it's a much less, in a sense, Judeo-Christian kind of view of kind of the supernatural. Again, it's there for a reason. It's there to support society, but it doesn't necessarily only, it serves the whole community, right? It serves the common good rather than having this sort of narrow, like the ruling class created religion to serve them and never shall it serve anyone else. Yeah, please.
Does that mean that he thinks that straying away from religion is a negative?
Where's my crystal ball? I think for Durkheim, it carries certain inherent risks, right? That if you have something that binds together people in common values, if you kind of stray from that or get rid of religion, where do common values come from, right? It's not entirely clear. And those, religion was important for Durkheim in creating those shared values, which is why he's worried that as religion fades, everybody's going to sort of, almost in a Nietzschean way, kind of create their own values, right? But then, well, if I have my values that says, and sorry, this is a common kind of trope in some forms of like debate. It's like if my values say, it's perfectly fine to murder children because murdering children is fun, and you're like, no, that's horrible, you're a terrible person. If there's no kind of shared core of values in a society, and it's just, my values are this, your values are that, how do we resolve this difference? You're just a anti-child killing bigot. There's no way to kind of adjudicate those debates for Durkheim if there's not a shared core of values. Please.
So, if like, as I went a little bit on this, if we are slowly
Damn you.
I can write them, I have to. If we are kind of steadily moving towards a more secular society, could we argue that through the theory of Durkheim, you could even explain like why we have more subcultures now? Because like everyone kind of craves these like similar values, so they kind of seek out the people to feel the same, and then they find other things they have in common. Next thing you know, you have like
Furries. You got furries, yeah, and bronies, and yeah. I mean, I think that's a sort of reasonable reading of Durkheim in that, yeah, I mean, people are going to try and find common groups that they can share. I think because they don't have that veneer of the supernat or like of religion, for Durkheim they're not going to be as durable, right? Religion gives values a kind of durability, right? And everybody is like, they're supposed to be things that everybody in a society, or at least a village, sort of adheres to and holds all the values together. So subcultures definitely, I think, would exist more as those values break apart. I don't know that Durkheim would necessarily think that's good, because, if you have your, Nambla over here and, other people over here, those values would still be hard to, Nambla, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, basically a pedophile group. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
So if we kind of look at groups that are traditionally like excluded from, so like one, I think, yeah, there's an example like the LGBTQ plus community. So historically, they've been kind of shut down. I'm not saying you can't be religious and part of that community.
Sure.
But they've kind of been a long-standing group that's been like, well, religion isn't going to accept us. We're going to just keep at it. If that makes sense.
I mean,
or are there like other things you can add that feel like they share common oppression, common?
It's a tricky subject in this sense. Like, until very recently, like, well, we know there's always been people who were, homosexual. I threw something. people wouldn't have thought of themselves in that way as a kind of identity until very recently. Until you kind of get sort of the breakdown of this kind of common good notion. I mean, it's not that people weren't, gay and attracted to people of the same sex and probably having sex with each other, but it wasn't thought of in the same way. So like in a sense, like the LGBTQ plus community is a really, really recent kind of social construction, right? It really can't, how to put this? It's not even really intelligible in a, say, medieval context, right? That you're like, the idea of a sexual identity isn't really a concept that people would have found intelligible until probably Freud, right? So relatively recently. And so they all would have been kind of put in, and yes, they would have been sort of forced to, do one of two things, probably. Like if you're talking, say, Catholicism, would have been like, well, you don't want to marry a woman or you don't want to marry a man. Well, you can be a nun or a priest, kind of set aside religiously in some way. Or you just sublimated those desires and lived like a normie, basically. Because there wasn't like this alternative, do you know what I mean? No one could think what that third option would be because the ideological system was so bounded by, those common interests and common beliefs. And it isn't until those start to break apart that even the idea of, wait, my orientation is different, I can live a different way, becomes intelligible, right?
Durkheim would say, like, at least the community as we know it today, it kind of has like an expiration date. Like maybe one day we'll go back to just not really considering sexuality as like a label. We just kind of do what you do.
That's entirely possible, right? If that ceases to be something that's socially seen as useful, things could be clawed back. I don't know, maybe we get hit by nuclear weapons and all of a sudden it's, we go back to an agrarian society. Maybe, maybe that identity doesn't make sense anymore. It's hard to know, right? And I'll tell you this, I'm bad at future casting. I can't even predict, who's going to win the Stanley Cup in a year where I have like 16 choices. So, I'm just like, I hate to make predictions about the future. But yeah, I think much of what we think of as like common sense and intelligible today, if you went back even 100 years, people would have been like, I don't understand the words coming out of your mouth, right? It makes no sense. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, I think I answered that. Can you argue those shared values are not based in HR? I read that as human resources. Like the bane of everyone's existence? Well, no. Yeah, can you argue those shared values are now based in human rights, at least in the liberal rest? Doesn't mean religion's obsolete, but is being replaced. I think that's a reasonable kind of reading. I think certainly with the argument that Tom Holland makes is that this notion of human rights is an attempt by a bunch of Westerners who, like a lot of the notions that are built into, say, Christianity, but don't really believe in the religious story anymore, to take those values and try to extricate them from religion, right, and universalize them. So I think that's a reasonable argument. I think that's a reasonable argument, even though I think those values probably still come from somewhere. But yeah, a sort of humanist vision. Now, how durable that humanist vision is outside of religion, I don't know. Okay, clear. Durkheim's ideas are materialistic, even though they... Yeah, I mean, so he does. The thing about Durkheim is, when people feel this collective effervescence, right? I don't know, like, you're at a revival meeting and you feel the Spirit moving, right? You feel like the Holy Spirit's elevating you. For Durkheim, it's like, well, there's nothing actually happening there other than you're having this kind of heightened emotional experience as a part of a group, right? For him, it's entirely psychological, right? It's all in your head, right? It exists only between both ears. And it is absolutely nowhere else. So it's materialist in the sense that it's a psychological effect of kind of group identity and nothing more. Okay. So when Durkheim says common good, he assumes that agreed upon values and norms are universal and are, to the group, right? Within that group, that the group sort of shares basic norms and values that are useful, especially in the medieval sense, for survival, right? Because if you don't all cooperate, well, you probably all starve to death, given how scarce, life was until about like 1890. You were probably all going to starve to death if there wasn't sort of deep cooperation. And so, yeah, I mean, it's universal within whatever group shares those values. And again, he thinks it's much more organic, right? He doesn't think that it was like some diabolical capitalist twirling his mustache, or a pope that wanted to maintain papal authority that came up with these things, but that they just sort of emerged socially in a very natural way, right? Because they were useful. They were more like, almost think of it like evolution. Useful traits of society emerge, or traits emerge in society. The useful ones get built up, the useless ones die off, and so but they emerge very naturally, much less like a plot, and much more kind of like organic. All right. I always think I'm going to make it further, but you have very good questions. Okay. So, Weber, Max, my good buddy, stressed that religion can contribute to social change, right? And this is where Weber is very different from especially Marx, right? And Weber coming a little bit later than Marx, right? He's mostly active after Marx dies, looks at Marx, the kind of work that came from Marx and other conflict theorists, and he says, well, this crudely economic way that Marx looks at things obviously misses the way that other things can change society, the ways that religion actually can be a catalyst for social change, or politics, or any number of other things, right? And the key work for Weber in this is a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and where he basically makes a connection between the rise of capitalism and certain religious ideas, right? And very specifically, hang on, I'll play a video for you, and we'll talk about Calvinism maybe next time. I don't know how much time we have. Let's play this short little clip, and then we'll go from there. Oh, good.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built out businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
All right, let's talk about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism next time, because we're out of time here. So we'll get into Protestant ethic in the next lecture. We'll keep going from here. The fun stuff really comes after these classical theorists, so it'll be a good time.